Hey there, Dr. Todd Wolfe here. Always code as if the guy who ends up maintaining your code will be a violent psychopath who knows where you live. Quoted by Mr. John Woods. I personally love this quote. I used to tell my coworkers the work that I did, the code that I created, only mattered to the person who inherited it after I left. Well, as I've grown older, I look at it from a different perspective. In many cases, I find myself inheriting my own code or looking back at it many years later and asking myself, why might I have done that? So that leads me to a conversation that I always tell my students, and for those who are new in the field, is consider best practices to follow right from the beginning when you learn how to do development. Much of the development I learned early on was self-taught. Self-taught because my mentors and peers moved on into areas whereby they actually had better, higher paying opportunities and left myself, who was new to the field, behind. They gave me some of the principles of good coding practices, but again, I was young, I had timelines to meet, and I didn't know all of the benefits or fully understand them. So that leads me to this concept. What are best practices that you can think of on top of the ones that I have highlighted here? The ones that I tell my students at a bare minimum to consider from the beginning is, first of all, security. Back when I started, security unfortunately was an afterthought. Much of what I created was wide open to SQL injection. I didn't know what that was about. If you're curious about SQL injection, check on my channel. You'll likely find a tutorial on it, and I will break it down and explaining why it's such a critical flaw in many applications, especially the space of the web. But broken access control, authentication, encrypting credentials, there's many other aspects of security, least privileged access you must consider. Consider that before you start coding. Think about it in your design phases. Keeping your code clean. Making sure you don't leave extra code in that's commented out. Leaving a mess behind for others to see. Using excess code where not necessary when you can actually reduce your overall code by using things like modularity, modules, functions, various other aspects to help keep your code clean. Comments, clear and concise. My favorite comment ever was, Todd, I did this because I had to, where the developer was expected to put comments in code that I peer reviewed, but they actually didn't know why it worked when they used it. So please take the time to explain and understand why you're putting code in your tasks. Good and consistent naming conventions. Come up with names that help you understand what something's being used for. Sometimes you might want to use variable abbreviations and camel conventions. Those are all good practices. Indent your code. Make sure your loops, your if blocks, your procedures, your functions are all nicely indented so you know where your code stops and starts. Portability. Use configuration files. Do not hard code values in your code and think you'll come back to them later. Chances are you won't come back to them later. Parameterize. Reusability and scalability. This is where you should use modular components if they exist. Think about modularizing your code in case you might want to use it elsewhere, maybe in that same project or maybe in a future project. So making modulars and components will allow for reuse, and on the positive side, you save on all of the testing and the unit testing of them except for that current implementation. So you can save a lot of time testing. And then last but not least, test cases. Don't overlook creating them. Don't just test your work yourself and make sure it's good. Make those test cases something that you can also reuse and replay. Manual testing takes a lot of time. Automate your test cases, make it part of your process, and you'll save time in the future by just doing regression tests running those same test cases. This is just a handful of good coding practices. Let this be a guide for you. Use the comments to share others that I may not have included here from what you thought might be good or perhaps from your experience. Love to hear from you. please subscribe, and I'll be in touch soon. Thanks.